The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was an imposing, sprawling space. Silver beams arced high above, woven together in a lattice of light that flickered with the gentle hum of energy. Representatives from dozens of species sat in resplendent chairs, their alien forms shimmering in the glow. The Earth delegation stood at the center of the room, 24 humans in sleek uniforms, their eyes flicking nervously around the room. At the far end of the chamber, the massive holographic screens flickered to life, displaying the species leaders. Captain Marcus Dixon, known as Mark to his colleagues, glanced around at his team. His jaw tightened as he adjusted his stance, pulling his broad shoulders back. He had been in tense situations before, battlefields, negotiations, press briefings, but nothing quite like this. The weight of humanity's future hung in the balance. Mark had risen through the ranks of the military before finding his place in diplomacy, a position that required far more tact and diplomacy than he'd ever imagined. He was used to working under pressure, yet this was different. This was the Galactic Council, a group of some of the most powerful and technologically advanced species in the universe. They had no real interest in humanity. To them, Earth was just a speck in the vast cosmos, a young species, still trying to find its place. Standing beside him was Lieutenant Ray Hawkins, known as Razor. His sharp features reflected the scrutiny they were under, but it was his mind that had earned him the title. Razor's hands were tucked behind his back, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm against his leg. A weapons specialist, born in the heart of New York, Razor was no stranger to danger. His skills, honed in combat, had transitioned well into his role on this mission, though, in this case, it wasn't about brute force. It was about proving humanity's worth without the luxury of overwhelming firepower. Behind them, Dr. Luis Rivera, Lou, adjusted his glasses and glanced around nervously. Lou had always been the quiet one of the group, preferring the solace of a lab to the spotlight. A Puerto Rican engineer, Lou was the one who had helped develop much of the technology the humans had brought to the Council. His work on human weapons had been revolutionary. His fusion of old Earth designs with cutting-edge science was impressive, though not nearly enough to garner the respect of the Council. General Thomas Weber, or Tom, was at the front of the group, his massive frame casting a shadow over the others. A Midwest-born warhorse, Tom had the demeanor of a man who'd seen too much war. He was blunt and often abrasive, but his experience gave him the sharp instinct that Mark knew they would need in this environment. He had no illusions about this meeting. It was going to be a challenge. Humanity was the underdog here, and he wasn't sure they could even land a punch. The hologram fizzled to life. A Zorixian leader appeared first. The Zorixians were a race of beings whose tentacles flared as they spoke, their skin glimmering with hues of purple and silver. A deep voice rumbled from the screen, a voice that carried centuries of arrogance. Humanity, your world has barely made it into the galactic fold, and you bring this. The screen split, showing a Koran, a towering humanoid with iridescent skin, flanked by floating metallic drones. His voice was equally dismissive. Primitive. Your weaponry is outdated, inefficient. How could you possibly think you are an asset to the Council with such toys? Mark stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor, as his team followed. He cleared his throat. Honorable representatives of the Galactic Council, humanity's weapons may not match the advanced technologies of your civilizations, but we bring other assets to the table. We are resourceful, adaptable, and... The voice of a Sothrian, an ancient race of floating entities, cut through his words. Their ethereal forms hovered in the air, a bright, swirling mist. Their leader's laugh echoed in the chamber. Adaptable. You will need more than your crude projectiles and explosive devices to survive in this galaxy. There are forces at play here that your primitive armaments could never hope to stand against. A sharp silence followed. The Zorixian leader glared down at Mark, the kind of look that would have shattered weaker men. You should understand your place, human, the Zorixian said, his voice dripping with disdain. You are not equipped for war. Not against us. Not against any of us. Mark's eyes hardened. He had expected mockery, but this was condescension at its finest. He took a deep breath, allowing his military discipline to reign in his emotions. He knew this was part of the process, the humiliation, the dismissal. What they didn't know was that humanity thrived under adversity. They didn't need the most advanced weapons. They just needed a chance. Beside him, Razor's hands twitched as though ready to grab a weapon at any moment, but Mark held his hand up, signaling him to stay calm. They had a plan, but now was not the time. Lou, too, seemed on edge, fidgeting with his own technology and muttering to himself. The silence stretched. Tom stepped forward, his thick arms crossed as he surveyed the council. His deep voice boomed out, a statement rather than a question. "We're here to talk, not fight. But I'd suggest not underestimating us." The Corin leader sneered. "Talk. You have no leverage, no advanced weaponry. What could you possibly offer?" Mark took a step back, signaling Lou to bring forward their latest creation. "We've come prepared. This is just a glimpse of humanity's potential." He nodded to Lou, who reluctantly stepped forward, holding a large, bulky device. It was a human-made flamethrower, simple by galactic standards, but deadly. The Xerixian leader raised an eyebrow. "That is your grand solution? Fire." Mark didn't respond to the ridicule. He simply motioned for Razor to demonstrate. Razor stepped forward, switched on the device, and a roar of flame erupted from a nozzle, bathing a nearby demonstration area in a hot, bright inferno. There was silence, and then laughter. "You think flame will win you favor here?" the Xerixian laughed. "How quaint." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Sometimes," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unspoken weight, "it's not about the weapon. It's about the will to use it." For now, that would have to be enough. The Council may have mocked their weapons, but they hadn't seen the full extent of human determination. The news of the Krillian occupation on Tylon came just as the human delegation was about to leave the Galactic Council's headquarters. Mark had barely stepped off the shuttle when the call came through. A crackling voice from the command center at Earth's central military base, a familiar voice, Tom's, filled his earpiece. "Mark, we've got a real mess. The Krillians took over Tylon 4. They're holding the whole colony hostage. The Council's refusing to intervene, said it's a human issue. You need to get back here. Now." Mark paused, the weight of situation sinking in. Tylon was a small, resource-rich human colony at the edge of the settled universe. Its mines had been a vital resource for Earth's expanding fleet, and losing it to the Krillians, a ruthless and expansionist alien race, would be a devastating blow. The Krillians were known for their brutal tactics. They'd overrun settlements before, leaving only destruction in their wake. They didn't take prisoners. The human delegation, standing in the shadow of the Galactic Council's mockery, suddenly found themselves thrust into a dire crisis, a crisis no one else in the galaxy seemed willing to address. "Mark." Tom's voice crackled again, snapping Mark out of his thoughts. "We're on our way," Mark replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The shuttle ride back to Earth's military command was tense. Razor, Lou, and Tom were already on board. The mission now turned into a race against time. Razor's hands were clenched into fists, his normally sharp features darker than usual. He was angry. Angry that the Council had mocked their weapons, and even angrier that no one was willing to help. Lou, sitting hunched over a data pad, was furiously scribbling notes as he went over specs for the new weapons he'd been developing, his mind already reeling with ideas. His usually quiet demeanor was replaced with a restless energy. Despite everything, the situation stirred something in him, a drive to prove humanity's worth. Tom, as always, was silent. His face was set in a hard, implacable mask. He had a military man's pragmatism, and that included the cold truth. Humanity was on its own. It always had been. The Council had shown them where they stood, and now it was time to take matters into their own hands. As they landed in the command center, the situation became clearer. The Krillians had taken control of Tylon 4's central city and its surrounding infrastructure. Communication had been severed, and the colony's defenders were all but overwhelmed. A large portion of the human military on the planet had already been decimated in skirmishes, and reinforcements were still too far away to help. Mark took a breath, scanning the holographic map of the colony's layout. He turned to Tom. "What's our plan?" Tom looked over the map, his eyes narrowing. "We can't storm the city head-on. Not with what we have. They've got superior numbers, better firepower. It's going to be guerrilla tactics, hit them where it hurts." Razor crossed his arms. "And what do we hit them with?" "Our toys, as the Council so kindly put." Not just our toys, Mark replied, his eyes sharpening. It's about using them in ways they haven't seen before. We've got explosives, we've got flame, we've got human ingenuity. And we're going to make it count. The team gathered around, strategizing. Lou was already on the holographic display, pulling up blueprints for the flamethrowers, their latest weapon design. They had been mocked by the council, sure, but Lou knew something they didn't. Humanity's ingenuity had always been its greatest strength. They didn't need the most advanced technology, they just needed to use what they had smarter than anyone else. I've been modifying the flamethrowers, Lou said, his voice low but steady. I think I can enhance the fuel, make it burn hot longer. It'll cut through Krillian shields and armor. We just need to get it to the front lines. Razor's eyebrows shot up. You're serious? The flamethrowers? The same ones they laughed at. Lou nodded, his hands moving swiftly over the console. I'm serious. You'll see. Mark gave a quick nod. Good. We've got one shot at this. Razor, get the weaponry in position. We'll need it ready when we hit their supply lines. Tom, get the infantry organized. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. Tom's eyes softened for a moment, a rare flicker of concern. This isn't going to be easy, Mark. If we mess up, we lose it all. We might not even get out of this. I know, Mark said, meeting his eyes. But we don't have a choice. We're fighting for humanity's place in this galaxy. For Tylan, and for the future. They set out quickly, moving through the war room with practiced urgency. Razor and Lou went to work on the flamethrowers, while Mark and Tom coordinated the remaining forces. They knew they couldn't afford a full-scale assault. They'd have to hit fast, hit hard, and then disappear before the Krillians could regroup. As night fell on Tylan, the team was ready. The first attack came from the forests surrounding the colony, where the team had set up a series of makeshift traps. Razor led the way, carrying a heavily modified flamethrower. Lou's modifications had worked. Streams of blue flame erupted from the nozzle, searing through the dense Krillian armor with terrifying precision. Razor moved like a shadow, taking down sentries one by one, each burst of flame illuminating the night. Mark and Tom followed closely, rallying the human defenders. They pushed the Krillians back, inch by inch, using the terrain and the cover of darkness to their advantage. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. For every soldier they lost, 2 Krillians fell. The tide was beginning to turn. Lou, standing back in a hidden position, monitored the action. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched his flamethrower in action. The weapon was working beyond his expectations. The Krillians had underestimated humanity, had laughed at their primitive technology. But it was working, and that was all that mattered. But as the battle raged on, Mark knew that this was just the beginning. They had won a small victory, but the real test was still ahead. The Krillian fleet was still in orbit, and they had no illusions about what was coming. They had their weapons, their tactics, and their resolve. But could humanity truly stand against a force like the Krillians? Mark didn't have the answer yet, but as he looked out at the burning city, he knew one thing. They weren't going down without a fight. The sound of explosions echoed through the desolate streets of Tylan, for the city now a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and smoldering wreckage. Razor moved with purpose, his flamethrower strapped securely to his back. He'd never been one to question orders, but as he scanned the skyline, a knot of unease twisted in his gut. The Krillians had underestimated the human fighting spirit, but that didn't mean this was over. Not by a long shot. Lou was close behind him, lugging a backpack of incendiary rounds, his eyes focused, but his face a mask of uncertainty. They're regrouping, Lou muttered, scanning the datapad that displayed a map of the city's defenses. We've taken some ground, but they're pushing back. We need more time. Mark's voice crackled in through their comms, steady as always. We're not done yet. We've slowed them down, but we need a final push. You've got the weapons, Razor. Lou, make sure those modifications hold. Razor could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. The Krillians had anticipated human desperation, but they hadn't accounted for how well humanity adapted. Still, this was their first major victory, and Razor wasn't about to squander it. Understood, he replied, his voice tight. The human forces, though fewer in number, had pushed the Krillians back to the central hub of the colony, a sprawling, fortified complex where they dug in deep. Razor had no illusions about the next phase of the battle. They had no backup, no reinforcements. It was them against a superior enemy, and it would take everything they had to finish the job. Lou adjusted his glasses, his fingers flying over his datapad as he rapidly calculated the trajectory for the next round of modifications. Razor's flamethrower had been their ace in hole, but the Krillians were learning, adapting. Every human advantage was being chipped away at. They'd need more than just fire to win this. "I've got it," Lou said, a rare spark of excitement in his voice. "I can enhance the fuel again, add a burst of plasma energy. It should burn through their shields. It won't be pretty, but it should work." "Make it happen," Razor grunted. He didn't need to understand the science behind it, just that it would work. They didn't have the luxury of waiting. The tension in the air was palpable. The battle had shifted from one of open combat to a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The Krillians had locked down the main approach, anticipating another frontal assault. But Mark knew that their greatest strength lay in their ability to think differently. The human mind didn't operate like the other species in the galaxy. It wasn't bound by tradition or superior technology. It was guided by an unyielding will to survive and to adapt. "Move out." Mark's voice came through again, but this time there was something else in it, something razor-sharp, something that reminded Razor of the old battlefield commanders, the kind who knew what it took to win. The squad moved into position, and Razor, feeling the familiar weight of his weapon, took his place in the front. He was the one who would clear the way. He was the one who would ignite the path for the others. The first round of plasma-infused incendiaries from Lou's latest modification hit their mark, a deep-throated roar of flame erupting from the nozzle. The flame tore through the air, bathing the Krillian barricades in a storm of fire and light. Razor's aim was steady, and as the first round of Krillian soldiers scrambled to avoid the fire, Razor fired again. The new plasma burst was a jagged, violent eruption, melting through enemy shields as if they were tissue paper. For a moment, the battlefield was a spectacle of destruction, alien tech sizzling under the force of the flame. It didn't take long for the Krillians to retaliate, their own weapons unfurling from the depths of their fortified compound. Razor could feel the pressure mounting as explosions ripped through the ground around him. Lou was firing off the last of the modified incendiary rounds, his hands shaking as he continued to feed the flamethrowers. But as the human team pushed further into enemy lines, Razor noticed something that made his gut twist in a way that nothing on the battlefield had. There was a shifting in the air, an unsettling quiet that fell over the team as they approached the central compound. The Krillians were waiting, but they weren't acting the way they had before. They were playing a different game. Mark's voice broke through the eerie silence in Razor's earpiece. "Something's not right. Stay sharp, everyone. They've set a trap." Razor didn't hesitate. He could feel the change in the air. The Krillians were setting up something bigger, something that would turn the tide of battle. His instincts were razor-sharp, honed by years of combat. He pushed forward, running towards the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The new rounds burned brightly in the barrels of their flamethrowers, but Razor's mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next move. Behind him, Lou was trailing, still feeding the flames, but Razor could see his friend's face tighten as they reached the final stretch. It was a dead zone, a kill zone, where every movement was amplified and every misstep could cost them their lives. Razor wasn't about to let that happen. Tom, ever the strategist, barked orders over the comms. "Fall back. Get to cover. Now." But it was too late. The ground beneath them erupted. The sound was deafening, a roar of destruction, as a massive explosion tore through the earth. Razor felt his heart leap into his throat as he dove for cover, narrowly avoiding the shockwave. He could hear the screams of the other soldiers, the crackling of energy as Krillian weapons locked onto them. Mark's voice came through, more urgent now. "Razor, Lou, get out of there. We're going to be surrounded." Razor gritted his teeth, rising from the ground. He wasn't done. They weren't done. The Krillians had pushed too far, and now it was time to remind them what it meant to face humanity in the heat of battle. Razor. Lou's voice was strained over the comms, but Razor didn't stop to reply. The situation was changing too quickly. The flamethrower was ready. And with a roar, Razor ignited it, his path now clear in the sea of chaos. The flame cut through the smoke like a blade, a beacon of human defiance in the heart of the storm. The battlefield had become a furnace. Flame and smoke mingled in the air as Razor, Lou, and the rest of the human team fought their way through the Krillian defenses. Razor's flamethrower was relentless, spewing torrents of fire that licked at the edges of the enemy's fortifications. He was a man on a mission, his every action honed by the singular purpose of survival. But even he knew this wouldn't last long. The Krillians had no intention of retreating. They were digging in deeper, readying their counterattack. Mark's voice came through his earpiece, steady, the calm in the storm. "We're cutting them down, Razor, but we need a plan. They're regrouping. We're out of time." Razor's eyes darted around the battlefield, his body moving almost on instinct. The Krillians were no longer just shooting. They were setting up their own heavy artillery, forcing the human forces into an ever-narrowing perimeter. Razor's flamethrower could only do so much before the shields would regenerate, and the Krillians were adapting fast. Lou's voice crackled in the background, still working on modifying incendiary rounds. His tech-savvy brilliance had given them an edge, but wasn't enough now. He was muttering under his breath, calculating, analyzing, trying to find the answer in a flood of chaos. Razor couldn't afford to listen. Every moment mattered. They couldn't afford to lose Tylon, not just for the resources it provided, but for humanity's place in the galaxy. The Council might have mocked them. The Krillians might have underestimated them. But here they were, fighting for something no one else would fight for, their home, their survival. Mark gave the order. "Fall back to the outskirts. They've set a perimeter. Lou, Razor, get those incendiaries ready for a final push." It was a dangerous move. Mark knew it, Tom knew it, and Razor knew it. But they had no other choice. They had to finish this, quickly. "Razor, stay sharp." Tom's voice echoed in Razor's earpiece, but the noise of the battlefield drowned out most of it. The ground trembled beneath them as the Krillian artillery began firing, the pulses of energy cutting through the air, carving up the landscape around them. Razor's heart pounded, his pulse in time with each shot. Lou was already making his way toward Razor, his arms loaded with modified rounds, sweat dripping down his face. "This should be it," Lou muttered, almost to himself. "The final modification. We can take them down now." Razor nodded but didn't speak. Lou's modifications had worked so far, but Razor knew that in battle, things never went according to plan. The environment was too unpredictable, and the enemy was too determined. Razor had seen it before on other battlefields, in other wars, and it was the same now. A hard lesson, nothing was guaranteed. As they approached the final stretch, the pressure mounted. Razor was the first to cross the line, his flamethrower already blazing. The sight was a terrifying one, a human wielding fire against an enemy species that had, until now, seemed invincible. And yet, the Krillians had never encountered this kind of defiance. Humanity's resourcefulness, its refusal to lie down and die, was something they could not prepare for. The first wave of Krillian troops came charging, their bodies covered in shimmering, plated armor. Razor took aim, his hand steady as he squeezed the trigger. The flame that erupted was an inferno, bright and unstoppable. It tore through the first line of advancing soldiers, the plasma-fueled fire cutting into their shields, melting through their weapons. But the Krillians were relentless. They adapted too quickly, shifting their tactics to overwhelm the humans with sheer numbers. Razor could see the tide turning, could feel it in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him. This wasn't just a battle for a colony. This was a fight for survival, for humanity's place in a galaxy that had written them off as insignificant. Mark's voice came through again, urgent this time. "Razor, Lou, we need you to hold the line. We can't give them an inch. We've got one shot at this." Razor pushed forward, trying to ignore the pressure building in his chest. He'd seen too many men fall, too many friends lost to the grind of war. But humanity, as Mark had said, was different. They didn't give up. They didn't run when things got tough. Lou adjusted the flamethrower, loading in another round. "Ready," he said, his voice low. The fire that erupted this time was brighter, hotter, a violent force that lit up the battlefield like a second sun. The Krillians recoiled, their shields flickering under the intense heat. Razor advanced again, His weapon, a roaring dragon that lashed out with every step. He could feel the ground beneath him shake with every explosion, every volley of enemy fire, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. And then something changed. A new wave of Krillians appeared, faster, stronger. Razor's eyes widened as the ground beneath them split open, revealing an armored, towering figure, the Krillian commander. This wasn't just another soldier. This was the leader of their forces, the one who'd been calling the shots from the start. He emerged from the wreckage like a god of war, his massive form clad in reinforced combat armor, his energy shield flickering with deadly force. The rest of the Krillian troops followed, their morale instantly boosted by the appearance of their commander. Razor could feel the tide shift again. The battle was no longer just about the colony. It was about breaking their will to fight, crushing their defiance. Mark's voice was strained now, the weight of leadership heavy on him. Fall back. We've got to regroup. Get Lou and Razor out of there now. But Razor wasn't listening. He couldn't. He had a job to do. This was humanity's last stand, and if it was to be their last, he would make it count. Razor, don't do it. Lou shouted over the comms, but Razor was already moving. His heart pounded as he squeezed the trigger once more, sending a barrage of flame into the Krillian commander's shield. The shield buckled but held, the leader advancing with terrifying speed. Razor reached for his backup weapon, one that hadn't been part of the original plan. It was a crude device, built from spare parts, but in that moment, it was all he had left. A flash of brilliance hit him, human ingenuity at its finest. The device wasn't designed for this, but that didn't matter. He aimed it directly at the Krillian commander. His hands were steady as he triggered the final shot. The explosion rocked the battlefield, a flash of light so bright it could have blinded the stars. The shockwave knocked Razor to the ground, but as the smoke cleared, he saw it. The commander had fallen. The shield had failed. Humanity had won, but only just. Razor didn't know how long it would take for the battle to be remembered, or for the Council to understand what had just transpired. But for now, it didn't matter. What mattered was that humanity had stood firm against impossible odds and refused to bow. Razor let out a slow breath, watching as Mark and Lou reached him, their faces streaked with soot but filled with something else, a quiet, unspoken recognition. They had survived.